The sky above Europe was on fire. Thousands of feet below, entire cities disappeared beneath clouds of smoke. Every bomber crew knew the odds. Every fighter pilot understood one terrifying truth. The deeper they flew into Nazi Germany, the fewer of them would return home. By early 1943, the Allied air campaign had reached a breaking point. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces were determined to destroy Hitler's war machine. Factories, railroads, oil refineries, aircraft plants. Everything had become a target. But there was one problem no amount of courage could solve. Their bombers simply couldn't survive. German fighters waited patiently beyond the range of Allied escorts. Once the Spitfires and Hurricanes turned back toward England, the Luftwaffe struck. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Veteran German aces dove into helpless formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. Within minutes, entire bomber groups vanished from the sky. Some missions ended with nearly one bomber in every 4 destroyed. Crewmen who survived described the air battles as flying through a wall of exploding steel. Many never even saw the fighters that killed them. British commanders knew something had to change. Not next year. Not next month. Immediately. The Allies desperately needed one aircraft capable of doing what no fighter had ever done before. Escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Fight German interceptors on equal terms. Then bring its pilots safely home. Many believed such an airplane simply didn't exist. They were wrong. Across the Atlantic, inside an American aircraft factory, engineers were quietly creating a machine that would change aerial warfare forever. It wasn't designed by famous British engineers. It wasn't originally powered by Britain's legendary Merlin engine. And almost nobody expected it to become history's most celebrated escort fighter. Its name was the North American P-51 Mustang. At first glance, it looked elegant, almost graceful. Its long nose, bubble canopy, and perfectly streamlined wings made it unlike anything flying over Europe. But appearances can be deceiving. Hidden beneath that polished aluminum skin was a machine capable of extraordinary speed, astonishing range, and deadly firepower. Still, blueprints mean nothing. Specifications don't win wars. Only pilots could answer the real question. Would this American fighter survive against Germany's best? The first people trusted to find out were not Americans. They were veterans of Britain's Royal Air Force. Men who had survived the Battle of Britain. Pilots who had flown Hurricanes, Spitfires, Typhoons, and nearly every Allied fighter in existence. These were men who rarely handed out compliments, especially to a foreign airplane. Many expected the Mustang to disappoint. Some believed it was simply another experimental design that looked impressive on paper. Others assumed no American aircraft could ever equal Britain's legendary Spitfire. After all, the Spitfire had become a symbol of British survival itself. Replacing it seemed almost impossible. Then came the first flight. One by one, RAF test pilots climbed into the unfamiliar cockpit. They adjusted the seat, checked the gauges, wrapped their hands around the control stick. The engine roared to life. A deep, smooth, confident growl unlike anything many of them had ever heard. As the Mustang accelerated down the runway, several experienced pilots immediately noticed something unusual. It wasn't struggling. It wasn't fighting the air. It almost seemed to float. Within seconds, the wheels left the ground, and everything they thought they knew about fighter aircraft began to change. One RAF pilot would later describe his first impression in remarkably simple words. It felt as though the airplane wanted to fly. Another admitted he had expected an average aircraft. Instead, he found one that seemed almost effortless. Fast, stable, responsive, powerful, yet surprisingly forgiving. Even before entering combat, many experienced pilots sensed they were flying something extraordinary, something different, something history had never seen before. But first impressions are easy. The real test waited across the English Channel. There, over occupied Europe, the Mustang would face Germany's deadliest fighter pilots. And only then would the Royal Air Force discover whether America's newest fighter was merely beautiful, or truly capable of changing the course of World War II. For every new fighter aircraft, there comes a single defining moment. Not during a dogfight, not after a victory, but during its very first flight. Because pilots know within minutes whether an airplane is merely good, or truly exceptional. For the Royal Air Force, that moment arrived when experienced combat pilots climbed into the cockpit of an unfamiliar American fighter known simply as the Mustang. At first, expectations were modest. The RAF had flown American aircraft before. Some were reliable. Some were useful. But few had matched the performance of Britain's beloved Spitfire. Most pilots assumed the Mustang would be another capable machine, nothing more. They were about to be proven wrong. A fighter born for Britain. Ironically, the Mustang wasn't originally built for the U.S. Army Air Forces. Its story began in 1940, when Britain desperately needed more fighters after the Battle of Britain. Instead of producing older aircraft under license, the American company North American Aviation made a bold promise. They would design an entirely new fighter from scratch. And they would do it in just over 100 days. Many believed the deadline was impossible. Yet the engineers succeeded. The prototype flew in October 1940, astonishing observers with its clean aerodynamic design and advanced laminar flow wing. At low altitude it was fast. Very fast. But there was one major flaw. Powered by the Allison V1710 engine, the early Mustang lost performance at high altitude, exactly where the air war over Europe was being fought. For bomber escort missions above 25,000 feet, it simply wasn't enough. The Merlin transformation. Everything changed when British engineers proposed fitting the aircraft with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin had already earned a legendary reputation in the Spitfire and Hurricane. But no one knew what would happen when that engine was paired with the Mustang's remarkably efficient airframe. The answer exceeded every expectation. The aircraft's top speed climbed above 430 miles per hour. Its climb rate improved dramatically. Its high-altitude performance became world-class. And thanks to its exceptionally low aerodynamic drag, it could fly farther than almost any fighter in existence. The result wasn't simply an improved airplane. It was an entirely new category of fighter. It felt different. The first RAF evaluation flights began soon afterward. Veteran pilots approached the aircraft with healthy skepticism. Many had thousands of combat hours. Some had survived the Battle of Britain. Others had fought over North Africa or the skies of occupied France. They knew exactly what to look for. As the Merlin engine came alive, several pilots noticed something immediately. The vibration was smooth. The throttle response was crisp. Taxiing felt surprisingly easy despite the aircraft's long nose. Then came takeoff. The acceleration was stronger than expected. The Mustang gathered speed effortlessly, lifting from the runway with remarkable stability. One RAF test pilot later recalled that the airplane required almost no struggle. Instead of wrestling the controls, the aircraft seemed eager to fly. A pilot's airplane. Once airborne, the surprises continued. The controls felt light but precise. The aircraft responded instantly without becoming unstable. High-speed turns remained smooth. Visibility from the cockpit was excellent for its era. Even during steep climbs, the Mustang inspired confidence. Pilots who expected heavy control forces discovered something entirely different. The airplane felt balanced, almost elegant. One RAF pilot famously remarked, "It felt as though the airplane wanted to fly." That simple observation captured what many experienced aviators struggled to describe. The Mustang didn't fight its pilot. It worked with him. More than just speed. Speed alone never wins air battles. What mattered even more was how an aircraft behaved after reaching combat altitude. The Mustang excelled there too. It maintained energy during long climbs. It accelerated quickly in a dive. Unlike many fighters, it retained excellent control even at very high speeds. This meant RAF pilots could dictate the terms of an engagement. If they wanted to attack, they had the speed. If they needed to escape, they had the speed. If they wanted to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, they finally had the range. For the first time, one fighter possessed all three advantages. Respect earned, not given. RAF pilots were not known for easy praise. Many remained fiercely loyal to the Spitfire. And with good reason. The Spitfire had defended Britain during its darkest hour. Nothing could replace its place in history. Yet many pilots admitted the Mustang offered something different. It wasn't trying to be another Spitfire. It was built for a different mission. Long-range escort. High-altitude combat. Sustained operations over enemy territory. In those roles, it appeared unmatched. One experienced RAF officer summarized the aircraft in remarkably practical terms. "This fighter could take us to the battle, fight the battle, and bring us home." That was exactly what Allied commanders had been searching for. The mission ahead. Still, no aircraft earns its reputation on test flights alone. The skies over England were forgiving. The skies over Germany were not. Waiting across the channel were battle-hardened Luftwaffe pilots flying the formidable Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190. Those pilots had spent years mastering aerial combat. They had destroyed hundreds of Allied aircraft. They had no reason to fear another new fighter. But they had never faced one quite like the Mustang. Soon, RAF pilots would escort bombers farther into Nazi territory than ever before. And during those missions, the words spoken after the first test flights would be put to the ultimate test. Would the Mustang truly change the air war? Or would it become just another promising aircraft lost to history? Test flights can reveal an airplane's potential. Combat reveals its truth. By late 1943 and into 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a deadly turning point. Every daylight bombing mission carried enormous risk. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the English Channel in massive formations, heading toward factories, oil plants, rail yards, and aircraft assembly lines deep inside Nazi Germany. But the bombers had one fatal weakness. For years, escort fighters lacked the range to stay with them all the way to their targets. Pilots in Spitfires and earlier escort fighters were often forced to turn back before reaching Germany's industrial heartland. From that moment on, the bombers were alone. And the Luftwaffe knew exactly when to strike. The hunters were waiting. German fighter controllers watched Allied formations on radar. They didn't rush into battle. They waited. Once the escorts disappeared over the horizon, waves of Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf FW 190s climbed into position. Then they attacked. They came from above, from below, from the sun. Some made high-speed head-on passes through the bomber formations. Others targeted damaged aircraft falling behind the group. The results were devastating. Entire bomber crews disappeared in minutes. Veteran airmen later described the sky as a storm of machine gun fire, exploding shells, and burning aircraft. Losses became so severe that some military planners questioned whether daylight bombing could continue at all. The Allies needed more than a good fighter. They needed one that could stay with the bombers from takeoff to landing. A new kind of escort. That fighter was now ready. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and external drop tanks, could travel farther than any Allied fighter before it. Instead of turning back near the German border, Mustang pilots continued east, farther, deeper, until they reached Berlin itself. For the first time, Allied bombers had continuous fighter protection over much of their route. It was a revolutionary change in strategy. And everyone, friend and foe alike, noticed. First contact. As RAF Mustang squadrons crossed into hostile airspace, tension filled every cockpit. Many of these pilots had spent years fighting the Luftwaffe. They respected their enemy. German fighter pilots were experienced, disciplined, and dangerous. Nobody expected an easy victory. High above the clouds, the first enemy aircraft appeared as tiny black dots on the horizon. Moments later, those dots became unmistakable silhouettes. Bf 109s. FW 190s. Closing fast. The radio came alive. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. The battle had begun. The Mustang proves itself. The German pilots attacked with confidence. For years, they had relied on superior positioning and the limited range of Allied escorts. But something was different. This time, the escorts didn't disappear. Instead, they climbed to meet the attack. RAF Mustang pilots quickly discovered one of the aircraft's greatest strengths: energy. The Mustang could dive rapidly, accelerate with remarkable efficiency, and climb back into position without losing as much momentum as many of its opponents. In aerial combat, maintaining energy often meant maintaining control of the fight. Veteran pilots recognized this almost immediately. Instead of reacting to German attacks, they could initiate their own. Confidence replaces doubt. Several RAF pilots later recalled that the Mustang inspired confidence during combat in a way few aircraft ever had. Not because it was invincible. No fighter was. But because it gave them options. If an enemy appeared above them, they could climb. If they needed speed, they had it. If they chose to disengage, the aircraft responded instantly. The Mustang's predictable handling under pressure allowed pilots to focus on tactics instead of wrestling with their machine. One RAF veteran later summarized it simply: the airplane never distracted you. It let you think about the fight. For combat pilots, there could be no higher compliment. The Germans noticed. The Luftwaffe quickly realized they were facing something new. Reports from German units described an escort fighter that stayed with the bombers far longer than expected. Instead of attacking isolated bombers, German pilots increasingly found themselves intercepted before reaching their targets. The balance of the air war was beginning to shift. Not overnight. Not in a single battle. But mission by mission. Escort by escort. The Mustang was changing the rules. More than an aircraft. For RAF crews, the Mustang represented more than improved performance. It represented hope. Bomber crews who had once dreaded the long journey into Germany could now look outside their windows and see friendly fighters still flying beside them. That sight meant survival. It meant someone was there to meet the enemy first. Morale began to improve. Confidence returned. Pilots who had once expected staggering losses now believed victory in the air was possible. A new reputation is born. Within months, stories about the Mustang spread throughout Allied airfields. Ground crews admired its sleek design. Young pilots dreamed of flying it. Veterans respected what it could accomplish. The aircraft had earned something far more valuable than praise. It had earned trust. But the hardest battles still lay ahead. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated. Germany still possessed skilled aces, advanced fighters, and one final advantage: desperation. As Allied forces pushed closer to Berlin, air battles would become even more intense. And it would be in those desperate dogfights that RAF pilots would discover just how extraordinary the Mustang truly was. By the spring of 1944, the P-51 Mustang was no longer an experiment. It was no longer an unfamiliar American aircraft being evaluated by skeptical British pilots. It had become the Luftwaffe's newest nightmare. Every mission deeper into Nazi Germany brought another test. Another dogfight. Another chance to discover whether the Mustang truly deserved its growing reputation. And the pilots flying it were about to learn one lesson that no training flight could ever teach. In the skies over Europe, victory belonged to the pilot who kept his speed, managed his energy, and made the fewest mistakes. The enemy was still dangerous. Despite mounting Allied pressure, the Luftwaffe remained a formidable force. Many German fighter pilots had been flying since the early years of the war. Some had hundreds of combat missions behind them. Many were flying two of the finest fighters ever built. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was agile, fast, and deadly in experienced hands. The Focke-Wulf FW 190 packed tremendous firepower and excelled in diving attacks. RAF pilots respected both aircraft. One mistake against either could be fatal. The Mustang's superior range meant nothing if it couldn't survive a close-range dogfight. Now it would have to prove itself. The first turning fight. One RAF pilot later described spotting a Bf 109 diving toward the bomber formation. Instead of waiting for the attack, he pushed the Mustang into a steep dive. The aircraft accelerated effortlessly. The German pilot realized too late that he was now being chased instead of hunting. As both fighters screamed through the sky, the RAF pilot noticed something remarkable. The Mustang remained stable even at very high speed. Its controls stayed responsive. There was no feeling that the aircraft was becoming difficult to manage. That confidence allowed him to focus entirely on his opponent. Moments later, the German fighter broke away. The bombers remained untouched. A fighter that conserved energy. One of the Mustang's greatest strengths wasn't immediately obvious. It wasn't simply faster than many opponents. It managed energy exceptionally well. Every climb, every dive, every turn. The aircraft retained speed more efficiently than many contemporary fighters. Combat veterans quickly recognized the advantage. Instead of losing precious momentum during aggressive maneuvers, the Mustang often emerged ready for another attack. One RAF pilot explained that flying the Mustang felt less like forcing an aircraft through the air, and more like working with it. The machine rewarded smooth flying. Every movement felt deliberate. Every response predictable. In aerial combat, predictability could save lives. She never let me down. Several RAF veterans later reflected on the Mustang's reliability. Mechanical failures could happen in any wartime aircraft. But many pilots developed enormous confidence in the Mustang's engineering. One veteran later remarked, "She never let me down when it mattered." That wasn't a boast. It was an expression of trust. A fighter pilot often flew alone over hostile territory. There were no emergency landings behind enemy lines. No rescue helicopters. No second chances. Trusting your aircraft completely wasn't a luxury. It was essential. Protecting the bombers. As bomber streams crossed Germany day after day, Mustang squadrons adopted increasingly aggressive tactics. Rather than remaining tightly attached to the bombers at all times, experienced escort groups often swept ahead of the formation. Their goal was simple: destroy German fighters before they could organize an attack. This strategy transformed the air war. Instead of reacting to the Luftwaffe, the Allies forced the Luftwaffe to react to them. German pilots found themselves intercepted while climbing from their own airfields. Many never even reached the bombers. The Mustang wasn't merely defending Allied aircraft anymore. It was taking control of the skies. The psychological shift. Perhaps the Mustang's greatest weapon wasn't mounted in its wings. It was the confidence it gave Allied pilots. Before its arrival, many bomber crews expected to face enemy fighters alone. Afterward, they often looked outside their aircraft and saw Mustangs flying alongside them hundreds of miles inside Germany. That sight changed morale. Escort pilots felt it too. Instead of worrying about fuel shortages forcing an early return, they could focus entirely on protecting the bombers. The psychological balance began shifting toward the Allies. Confidence spread through the squadrons. Meanwhile, German pilots increasingly realized they could no longer count on facing unprotected bombers. Respect across both sides. Even German veterans later acknowledged the Mustang's impact. Many described it as one of the most capable Allied fighters they encountered during the final years of the war. Its range made it impossible to ignore. Its speed made it difficult to escape. Its pilots became increasingly experienced as the air campaign continued. RAF crews, meanwhile, never claimed the Mustang was invincible. Every mission still carried enormous danger. Aircraft were lost. Pilots were killed. Victory remained painfully expensive. But the Mustang dramatically improved their chances. And in war, sometimes better odds are enough to change history. The beginning of air superiority. By mid-1944, something extraordinary was happening. The Luftwaffe was no longer dictating where and when battles would occur. The initiative had shifted. Allied fighters now roamed deep inside German airspace. Factories, rail yards, airfields. Nothing felt beyond reach. The Mustang had become far more than a fighter aircraft. It had become the symbol of Allied air superiority. And RAF pilots who had once climbed into its cockpit with skepticism now spoke of it with unmistakable respect. Some even dared to compare it with Britain's beloved Spitfire. That comparison would spark one of aviation history's greatest debates. Which aircraft was truly the better fighter? Ask almost any Royal Air Force veteran one question. Which fighter was better, the Spitfire or the P-51 Mustang? And chances are, you'll get a different answer every time. For decades, aviation enthusiasts have argued over which aircraft truly deserved the title of the greatest Allied fighter of World War II. The sleek British Supermarine Spitfire, or the elegant American-built North American P-51 Mustang. It wasn't just a technical debate. For many RAF pilots, it was deeply personal, because they had trusted both aircraft with their lives. A legend before the Mustang. Long before the Mustang arrived over Europe, the Spitfire had already become a national symbol. In the summer of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, it stood between Britain and invasion. Its graceful elliptical wings became a symbol of resistance. Young RAF pilots climbed into Spitfires knowing they might never return. Many didn't. For those who survived, the aircraft represented far more than engineering. It represented survival. Freedom. Home. No new airplane, American or otherwise, could replace that emotional connection. Then came the Mustang. When RAF squadrons began receiving the Merlin-powered Mustang, many pilots naturally compared it to the aircraft they already knew. Some expected disappointment. Others expected only minor improvements. Instead, they found something entirely different. The Mustang wasn't designed to imitate the Spitfire. It had been built for a mission the Spitfire had never been intended to perform. Long-range escort. Deep penetration into enemy territory. Hours of continuous flight. And on those missions, it excelled. Different missions, different strengths. Veteran RAF pilots often explained that comparing the two fighters was like comparing two championship athletes competing in different events. The Spitfire was exceptionally agile. Its turning performance was legendary. At medium altitude, it could outmaneuver almost anything in the sky. Pilots often described it as feeling like an extension of their own body. It reacted instantly, gracefully, almost effortlessly. The Mustang, on the other hand, offered something equally valuable. Speed, endurance, stability, and unmatched range. It wasn't simply about winning a dogfight. It was about reaching the battlefield, winning the fight, and still having enough fuel to return safely. I choose the right tool. One RAF veteran was once asked which aircraft he preferred. His answer surprised many historians. He didn't choose one over the other. Instead, he reportedly replied, "I choose the right tool for the right job." If the mission required defending Britain close to home, he would gladly fly the Spitfire. If the mission required escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, he wanted the Mustang. That practical attitude reflected the opinion of many experienced RAF pilots. Rather than competing against each other, the two aircraft complemented one another. The Merlin connection. Ironically, the aircraft shared something remarkable: their heart. Both fighters achieved their greatest success powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Merlin became one of the most celebrated aircraft engines ever built. Reliable, powerful, adaptable. In the Spitfire, it helped save Britain during its darkest hour. In the Mustang, it transformed a promising fighter into one of history's greatest escort aircraft. Many RAF engineers later joked that the Merlin made almost everything better. In the case of the Mustang, they weren't exaggerating. What pilots loved about the Mustang. When RAF veterans reflected on the Mustang years after the war, several themes appeared again and again. They admired its remarkable range, its high-speed stability, its predictable handling, its comfortable cockpit during long missions. Most of all, what pilots loved about the Mustang. When RAF veterans reflected on the Mustang years after the war, several themes appeared again and again. They admired its remarkable range, its high-speed stability, its predictable handling, its comfortable cockpit during long missions. Most of all, they appreciated the confidence it inspired. Flying hundreds of miles over enemy territory required complete trust in both machine and engine. Again and again, Mustang pilots described that trust. Not because the aircraft was perfect, but because it consistently delivered when the mission demanded it. A new generation of air superiority. By late 1944, Allied air power had changed dramatically. German fighters were increasingly forced onto the defensive. Fuel shortages crippled pilot training. Experienced Luftwaffe veterans became harder to replace. Meanwhile, RAF and USAF Mustang squadrons appeared almost everywhere. Over factories, railroads, airfields, even above Berlin. The Mustang's long range allowed Allied commanders to maintain nearly continuous fighter pressure deep inside Germany. That strategic advantage proved devastating. The Luftwaffe could no longer choose when to fight. Increasingly, the Allies made that decision. The respect that lasted. Years after the war ended, reunions brought former RAF pilots together. Stories were exchanged. Memories revisited. Aircraft compared. Many still smiled when discussing their first flight in the Mustang. Not because it replaced the Spitfire, but because it accomplished something extraordinary. It expanded what a fighter aircraft could do. It gave bomber crews hope. It carried young pilots farther than they had ever imagined possible. And for many veterans, it helped bring them home. A machine that changed history. The Mustang wasn't the only reason the Allies achieved air superiority. Victory depended on thousands of aircraft, millions of workers, countless acts of courage. But the Mustang became one of the defining symbols of that effort. Its arrival marked the moment the balance in the skies began shifting permanently. Even Germany's highest commanders would recognize that the air war had turned against them. And much of that transformation could be traced to the long silver fighter escorting bombers all the way to the heart of the Third Reich. Every weapon has a moment when the enemy realizes the battlefield has changed forever. For Nazi Germany, that realization came high above the clouds. It didn't happen in a single dogfight. It wasn't caused by one ace pilot or one famous mission. Instead, it happened gradually. Escort after escort, raid after raid, day after day. The silver fighters simply kept coming, and they never seemed to run out of fuel. A new reality. By early 1944, German fighter controllers began noticing an alarming pattern. Their pilots expected Allied escorts to disappear before the bombers reached Germany's industrial heartland. That had always been the routine. Wait until the escorts turned back, then attack the bombers. But suddenly, the escorts weren't leaving. Instead, P-51 Mustangs stayed with the bomber formations far beyond the German border. Even over Berlin, the old tactics no longer worked. Every interception now carried far greater risk. Instead of attacking defenseless bombers, German pilots increasingly found themselves fighting fresh, determined escort fighters before they could even reach their targets. Hunting the hunters. The Mustang's mission soon expanded beyond escort duty. Allied commanders recognized that the best way to protect bombers wasn't simply to stay beside them. It was to destroy the Luftwaffe before it could attack. Mustang squadrons began flying aggressive fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber stream. Their targets included German fighters climbing to intercept, airfields launching enemy aircraft, rail lines supporting military logistics, transportation hubs feeding Germany's war machine. For the Luftwaffe, this was a strategic nightmare. Pilots could be attacked before they even reached combat altitude. Some encountered Mustangs within minutes of takeoff. The hunters had become the hunted. The pressure never stopped. Unlike earlier periods of the war, German pilots no longer enjoyed predictable breaks between major air battles. The Allies now maintained relentless pressure. Bomber raids by day, fighter sweeps before and after, reconnaissance flights, ground attack missions. The skies above Germany became increasingly dangerous. Fuel shortages made matters worse. Many young Luftwaffe pilots entered combat with only a fraction of the flight hours that earlier generations had received. Across the cockpit from them were seasoned RAF and USAF veterans flying one of the most capable long-range fighters in the world. It was an increasingly uneven contest. Respect from the other side. Many post-war interviews with former German pilots reveal an important truth. They respected the Mustang, not because they believed it was unbeatable, but because they understood what it represented. The P-51 combined excellent speed, high-altitude performance, long range, and dependable handling in a way that fit the Allies' strategic needs almost perfectly. German pilots knew that if a Mustang appeared on the horizon, escaping the engagement would not be easy. Several Luftwaffe veterans later acknowledged that the aircraft's presence dramatically complicated every interception mission. It forced them to fight on Allied terms rather than their own. RAF pilots noticed the difference. RAF Mustang squadrons also sensed the shift. Veteran pilots began noticing fewer large-scale coordinated German attacks. Instead, Luftwaffe formations often appeared smaller and more cautious. The enemy was still dangerous. Individual German aces remained highly skilled. But something fundamental had changed. The confidence that had characterized the Luftwaffe during the early years of the war was fading. One RAF pilot later reflected. You could feel that they were running out of time. The Mustang hadn't caused that change alone, but it had become one of the clearest symbols of it, winning the war beyond dogfights. The Mustang's greatest achievement wasn't measured only by enemy aircraft destroyed. Its true impact was strategic. By keeping bombers protected over long distances, the Allies could strike deeper into Germany than ever before. Factories producing fighter aircraft, synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, rail junctions, oil refineries. These targets were essential to Germany's ability to continue the war. Every successful bombing mission weakened the Nazi war machine. And every Mustang escort increased the chances those bombers would reach their targets. The aircraft didn't just win air battles. It helped make the Allied bombing campaign sustainable. The cost of victory. Yet every success came with sacrifice. RAF Mustang squadrons continued to lose pilots. Some were shot down in fierce aerial combat. Others fell victim to anti-aircraft fire. Mechanical failures, poor weather, and navigational errors claimed lives as well. Each empty seat at the squadron briefing reminded everyone that no aircraft, no matter how advanced, could eliminate the dangers of war. Veteran pilots rarely celebrated victory with excitement. More often they counted who had returned, and who hadn't. A legacy forged in combat. By the final months of the war in Europe, the Mustang had earned a reputation that extended far beyond Britain or America. Ground crews admired its reliability. Bomber crews trusted its protective presence. Commanders valued its flexibility. And RAF pilots, many of whom had once doubted an American-built fighter, now spoke of it with genuine admiration. It had proven itself not through advertising or promises, but through hundreds of dangerous missions over occupied Europe. Looking back, years later, when historians interviewed surviving RAF veterans, one theme appeared again and again. The first flight had impressed them. Combat had convinced them. The Mustang wasn't remembered because it was beautiful, or because it was fast. It was remembered because it consistently gave pilots the tools they needed to survive one of history's most brutal air wars. For many of those men, that made all the difference. But perhaps the most powerful reflections came decades later, when those same pilots looked back on the aircraft that had carried them through war, and explained in their own words what it truly meant to fly the legendary P-51 Mustang. Wars eventually end. The gunfire falls silent. The aircraft stop flying combat missions. The uniforms are folded away. But for the men who fought, the memories never truly disappear. Decades after World War II, former RAF pilots gathered at reunions, museums, and air shows. Their hair had turned gray. Their hands had grown slower. But when someone mentioned the P-51 Mustang, Their eyes often lit up exactly as they had in 1944. The airplane had become far more than a machine. It had become a chapter of their lives. More than aluminum and steel. To historians, the Mustang is measured by statistics. Top speed, combat radius, service ceiling, enemy aircraft destroyed. But pilots remembered something very different. They remembered the feeling. The smell of aviation fuel before sunrise. The vibration of the Merlin engine coming to life. The nervous silence before crossing the English Channel. The relief of seeing England's coastline again after hours over enemy territory. Those were the memories no technical manual could ever record. Trust was everything. When veterans were asked what made the Mustang special, many didn't begin by talking about speed or firepower. Instead, they talked about trust. A fighter pilot's relationship with his aircraft was deeply personal. Once the wheels left the runway, there was no one else to rely on. If the engine failed, if the controls jammed, if the fuel calculations were wrong, the consequences could be fatal. Again and again, RAF veterans described the Mustang as an aircraft they trusted. Not because it was flawless, but because it consistently performed when everything depended on it. One veteran reflected. When you climbed into a Mustang, you believed it would bring you home if you did your part. For many, that confidence meant everything. The Merlin's song. Ask any wartime RAF mechanic or pilot about the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and you'll often hear an emotional response. Veterans frequently described its sound as unmistakable. A smooth, powerful roar that inspired confidence before the aircraft even left the ground. When the Merlin was paired with the Mustang's streamlined airframe, many pilots felt they were flying something extraordinary. Several later admitted that even decades after the war, hearing a restored Mustang fly overhead instantly transported them back to the airfields of England. Back to briefing rooms. Back to early morning missions. Back to friends who never returned. Remembering those who didn't come home. Every Mustang pilot carried memories that extended beyond victories. Every squadron lost men. Some disappeared over France. Others were shot down above Germany. Some vanished into the North Sea without a trace. At post-war reunions, conversations often returned to those empty places at the table. Veterans rarely celebrated themselves. Instead, they remembered the friends whose stories ended too soon. One RAF officer later said, "The airplanes became famous. The men who flew them should never be forgotten." That quiet statement reflected the attitude shared by many who had survived. The aircraft that changed the air war. Military historians continue to debate which single aircraft had the greatest strategic impact during World War II. There may never be complete agreement. But one fact remains difficult to dispute. The P-51 Mustang fundamentally changed the Allied bombing campaign. Its long range allowed escort fighters to remain with bomber formations deep inside enemy territory. Its speed and altitude performance enabled it to challenge Germany's best interceptors. Its versatility allowed commanders to assign it to escort, reconnaissance, fighter sweep, and ground attack missions. It wasn't simply another successful fighter. It reshaped Allied air strategy, respect across generations. Today's fighter pilots fly aircraft with radar, guided missiles, satellite navigation, and fly-by-wire controls. Yet many continue to study the Mustang. Not because its technology remains modern, but because its story represents timeless lessons. Innovation, adaptability, teamwork, and the importance of designing equipment that perfectly matches its mission. Military aviation academies around the world still examine the Mustang as an example of how engineering, logistics, and operational doctrine can combine to produce strategic success. Its legacy extends far beyond World War II. Respect across generations. Today's fighter pilots fly aircraft with radar, guided missiles, satellite navigation, and fly-by-wire controls. Yet many continue to study the Mustang. Not because its technology remains modern, but because its story represents timeless lessons. Innovation, adaptability, teamwork, and the importance of designing equipment that perfectly matches its mission. Military aviation academies around the world still examine the Mustang as an example of how engineering, logistics, and operational doctrine can combine to produce strategic success. Its legacy extends far beyond World War II. Flying into history. Across the United States and Britain, beautifully restored Mustangs still take to the skies during commemorative air shows. Thousands gather to watch. Children point upward. Veterans quietly remove their hats. As the Merlin engine echoes across the airfield, history briefly comes alive again. For a few unforgettable moments, the sound is exactly the same. The silhouette is exactly the same. And for those who once flew it in combat, The memories are exactly the same. The final reflections. When historians interviewed surviving RAF Mustang pilots late in life, many offered remarkably humble answers. They rarely called themselves heroes. They rarely spoke about medals. Instead, they talked about responsibility, about protecting bomber crews, about supporting one another, about completing the mission, and about being fortunate enough to return. One veteran summarized his experience with quiet simplicity. It wasn't just the finest airplane I'd flown. It was the airplane that let us finish the job. Perhaps no statement better captures why the Mustang remains one of history's most respected fighters. Closing transition. The P-51 Mustang did not win the war by itself. No single aircraft ever could. Victory required the combined efforts of millions of soldiers, sailors, airmen, factory workers, engineers, and civilians across the Allied nations. But when RAF pilots first climbed into the cockpit of that sleek American-built fighter, many expected merely another airplane. What they discovered instead was a machine that would transform the air war, earn the respect of friend and foe alike, and secure its place among the greatest combat aircraft ever built. Its story did not end in 1945. It continues every time a Merlin engine starts, every time a silver Mustang climbs into the sky, and every time history remembers the men who trusted it with their lives. History rarely changes because of a single machine. More often, it changes because the right machine arrives, at exactly the right moment. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe looked very different than they had just 1 year earlier. The Luftwaffe, the force that had once dominated much of the continent, was fighting for survival. Allied bombers crossed Germany in numbers never before imagined. And beside them, stretching across the horizon, flew hundreds of silver fighters. The P-51 Mustang had become more than an aircraft. It had become a symbol. A symbol that the balance of air power had shifted. More than just a fighter. The Mustang wasn't the fastest aircraft ever built. It wasn't the most heavily armed. It wasn't the most maneuverable fighter of World War II. Yet historians continue to rank it among the greatest combat aircraft ever designed. Why? Because great weapons are not judged by one number. They are judged by the mission they accomplish. The Mustang could escort bombers farther than any Allied fighter before it. It could engage enemy fighters at high altitude. It could defend, reconnoiter, and even strike ground targets when required. Few aircraft combine so many strengths in one airframe. That versatility made it invaluable. The RAF's lasting impression. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, RAF pilots had accumulated thousands of combat hours in the Mustang. Many returned to civilian life. Some continued serving in the Royal Air Force. Others became airline pilots, instructors, engineers, or business owners. But years later, whenever they were asked about the aircraft they trusted most, the Mustang was almost always part of the conversation. Not because it replaced the Spitfire. Not because it erased Britain's aviation legacy. But because it added something new. It proved that endurance could be just as decisive as agility. That range could win battles long before the first shot was fired. A machine that united allies. The Mustang also represented something larger than engineering. It symbolized cooperation. An American-designed airframe. A British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. RAF and USAF pilots flying side by side. Ground crews from different nations maintaining the same aircraft. Together, they created one of the most effective fighter forces in military history. In many ways, the Mustang became a flying reminder that Allied victory was built on partnership. No nation won the war alone. Neither did this airplane. Preserving history. Today, more than 80 years after the end of World War II, dozens of restored P-51 Mustangs still fly. Some appear at airshows across the United States. Others are carefully preserved in museums. A few remain in private collections, maintained by passionate historians and pilots determined to keep the aircraft alive. Each restored Mustang requires thousands of hours of work. Every rivet, every instrument, every panel tells part of a much larger story. Not just about aviation, but about the generation that fought history's largest war. The sound that stops crowds. If you've ever attended an American air show, you've probably seen it happen. A distant roar echoes across the runway. People stop talking. Children point toward the sky. Veterans instinctively look upward. Then, emerging from the horizon, comes the unmistakable silhouette of the Mustang. Long nose, bubble canopy, graceful wings, and the unforgettable sound of the Merlin engine. For a few brief moments, time seems to stand still. Because that sound isn't just an engine. It's history. What RAF pilots really said. So, What did RAF pilots really say when they first flew the American P-51 Mustang? They didn't claim it was magic. They didn't say it made them invincible. Experienced combat pilots rarely spoke in absolutes. Instead, their praise was practical. They admired its balance, its stability, its extraordinary range, its predictable handling, its ability to carry them deep into enemy territory, fight effectively, and bring them home again. For men whose lives depended on every mission, that was perhaps the highest compliment any aircraft could receive. A legacy written in the sky. The true measure of the Mustang cannot be found in museum displays, or technical specifications, or even victory statistics. Its legacy lives in the stories of those who flew it. The young RAF pilot who climbed into an unfamiliar cockpit with doubt, and landed with admiration. The bomber crew that reached home because friendly fighters never turned back. The mechanic who worked through freezing nights to prepare one more aircraft for tomorrow's mission. The families who welcomed loved ones home because the Mustang extended the protective shield over Europe. Those stories are the aircraft's greatest legacy. Final reflection. Every generation creates machines that redefine what is possible. The P-51 Mustang was one of those machines. It didn't simply outperform expectations. It reshaped strategy, changed tactics, protected thousands of lives, and helped secure Allied control of the skies during one of history's most decisive conflicts. For the RAF pilots who first flew it, the experience began with curiosity. It ended with respect. And decades later, that respect never faded. Sometimes, history remembers the battles. Sometimes, it remembers the generals. But every now and then, history remembers an airplane. Not because it was perfect, but because when the world needed it most, it delivered. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a fighter. It became a promise. A promise that the bombers would not fly alone. A promise that courage would be matched by innovation. And a promise that freedom, defended from the skies, would endure. That is why, even today, the sound of a Mustang overhead still captures our attention. Not as a reminder of war, but as a tribute to the men who flew into history and came home to tell the story. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more untold stories from World War II, the Royal Air Force, and the legendary aircraft that shaped history, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive. Thank you for watching. And until next time, keep history alive.